Remember, by Katherine VanZwoll. Remember when we used to go to that cabin on Lake Michigan in the summer? My father, Hank Delaney, did not look up from the worn chair in the lounge of the assisted living facility. He bounced a baby doll gently on his knee and smiled into her perpetually happy, painted face. I willed him to spare a glance for his granddaughter, who sat coloring a few feet away, to no avail. With the TV muted, the memory care unit was deathly quiet. Today, only Irene was present, sitting in her wheelchair, watching the silent images shift on the screen. "I'd like to take Katie there this summer, if summer ever gets here." I forced a laugh, my eyes sliding past the beige walls to the window that displayed an equally dull, gray sky. Gray, gray, gray. I'd forgotten what winter was like in Michigan. Endless days of gray. "Don't you think Katie would like that, Dad?" At the sound of her name, Katie flicked a glance at me and then stared uncertainly at her grandfather. He paid her no heed, and after a few minutes she resumed her coloring. I watched the scene in growing anger and dismay as my dad cooed and brushed his finger along the doll's cheek, his own 5-year-old granddaughter all but invisible to him. I closed my eyes and breathed deeply, willing myself to relax my clenched fingers. I felt the anger slowly release through my fingertips and suddenly wanted to cry. It wouldn't be the first time. Why was I here? My dad had been diagnosed with Alzheimer's when I was living in California. My sister Sue had helped my mom take care of him until Sue's company relocated to Ohio. Steve, Katie, and I had moved from California to pick up the ball. Naively, I had welcomed the opportunity. Growing up, I had been Daddy's girl, and I wanted my dad to get to know Katie before it was too late. And I wanted to be there for him when he needed me, just as he'd always been there for me. But there seemed to be nothing for me to do. I was starting to think I'd uprooted my family for no reason. Without warning, I yanked the doll from my father's hands. Its rubber skin felt unsettling to my touch. "It's a doll, Dad. It's not a baby. It's a doll." He frowned and began to touch his fingers to his thumbs in a rhythmic, distressed motion. I felt immediate shame and remorse. Despite my shaking, I turned the doll carefully in my arms like a newborn and rocked it. "She's a beautiful baby, isn't she?" I asked. He smiled, his eyes sparkling, all transgressions forgotten. On some days, the slate wiped clean every 30 seconds or so. He chucked the doll under the chin and smiled. On the way out, Katie looked up into the gray sky and said impassively, "It's snowing again." She had seen snow for the first time just 3 months earlier. It had already lost its magic. In the midst of switching the phone to the other shoulder and pouring a glass of water, I noticed Stephen checking his watch for the 3rd time. I nodded my acknowledgement as I hunted for the bottle of extra-strength Tylenol. Sue was having trouble letting go of Dad's care. She constantly tried to micromanage from Ohio, and then complained about how much harder it had been for her to take care of him. It wasn't easy explaining to him why he wasn't allowed to drive, or why he had to move into the home, you know. "Well, I'd take those any day if he knew who I was when I told him," I snapped back. On the other end of the line, Sue sighed deeply. Her acknowledgement, apology, and segue into a new topic or tone all rolled into one. "Even when Dad doesn't know you, I think there's a part of him that knows you're there." I downed 2 Tylenols in lieu of a response. Stephen parked his carry-on next to the door, and I signaled for 1 more minute. It was time to take him to the airport for a business trip. "Mom needs you too, even if you have to force it down her throat," she added. I laughed. That's what I'd have to do. She's not exactly one to go to a support group. I know. I already lost that battle. Take her shopping and get your nails done. That's all you can do. Lauren, do you wish you hadn't come back? You shouldn't ask me that when it's snowing, I said, glancing out the window at the ubiquitous, swirling white flakes. I didn't have time for a serious conversation now. It's 73 and sunny in California, you know. That's buttered toast, Sue replied, mirroring my light tone. Kind of comforting, good for sick people, but boring as heck if you had to eat it every day. Sounds pretty good right now. I wouldn't have minded this on Christmas, but no, Christmas was green and sunny. That's part of the exciting smorgasbord of Michigan. You never know what you'll get. The next morning, while I shoveled a path for my car, I grumbled about the smorgasbord that had vomited 6 inches of snow on my driveway overnight. And I cursed it again that night as I crept along slippery streets to deliver a spare pair of glasses to my dad. He had stepped on his at dinner, and he couldn't read without them. And my mother insisted he didn't sleep well unless he read a little at bedtime. But since my mom had almost no night vision and drove like a maniac under the best conditions, I reluctantly volunteered. Melting snow trickled down my back as I walked down the hall. The TV blared in the lounge to an empty audience, as usual. An aide sat with 2 residents at the table doing a puzzle. She waved hello. My dad walked out of his room and closed the door. He looked up and smiled at me. Howdy, stranger. What are you doing out in this cold, honey? You should be at home in front of the fireplace. Not when I can be here with you, I said, giving him a hug. Then I handed him the glasses. Mom wanted to make sure you could read before bed tonight. Helen takes good care of me, he said, smiling as he tucked them into his shirt pocket. Has since day one. Did I ever tell you that story? I'd heard it several times, but would never tire of it, especially since he seemed less talkative each passing day. One day, I'd be telling it to him. We walked to the settee, and I sat beside him and listened to the familiar tale of his crush on the new girl in the red dress who accidentally sprayed him with the garden hose. They had an electric clothes dryer. Had a glass window, so we talked and watched my clothes spinning around. It was a hoot on Highland Drive. He laughed and then looked around, suddenly uncertain. Do we live here now? Mom still lives on Walnut Street. You live here, but she visits you every day. Oh. His eyes clouded and he looked at me, confused. Where have I been all this time? What do you mean, Dad? I think I've been gone. Where have I been? My heart pounded with uncertainty and welling emotion. I wanted to wrap my arms around him to comfort him, but in my selfishness, in this one moment that I had my father back, I also wanted him to comfort me. I didn't know what to say. I looked around, as if a doctor might materialize out of nowhere, but even the aide had gone. We were alone. I held his hands. You have Alzheimer's, Dad. I do? Yes. You forget things. Oh, that's too bad. I could see the fog beginning to settle back in. Yes, it really is. It was a cold night, and the bed especially big and empty with Stephen gone. So when Katie sleepily crawled in next to me, I let her snuggle close. It had surely been no buttered toast day. Saturday dawned brighter, though of course not literally. The stubborn sky revealed not even a scrap of blue, but held tightly to its gunmetal gray, promising yet more flurries. But I didn't mind, because Stephen was coming home from his conference. To celebrate, Katie and I planned to take my parents out for breakfast. As my mom, Katie, and I walked through the ghost town of a unit, one of the aides stepped out of the nurse's station, looking across at the lounge in puzzlement. Then her expression changed to one of horror when she turned and saw us coming her way. A moment later, I knew why. My dad walked out of the lounge holding hands with a frail, white-haired woman. She and my dad smiled at one another as if they'd been happily married for 50 years. My mom came to an immediate stop and stared. My dad kept shuffling toward us, oblivious. My mom dropped Katie's hand, turned on her heel, and walked out, heedless of the alarm that she tripped by opening the door. Katie looked at me. I nodded, and she ran after my mom. I strode to my father, and none too gently broke his grip from the other woman's. "Dad, your wife was here to see you. Helen was here." He turned to the woman beside him. "This is Helen. This is my wife." "No, it's not," I said, gently pulling him away from the woman. My dad yanked his elbow from my grasp and stormed off. I started to follow, but he brushed me off with a wave of his hand. I realized there was no more to say, so I turned and walked out, setting off the alarm again. When I drove my mom home and walked her to the porch, she calmly told me to mind my own beeswax, but her hand shook as she struggled to unlock the door. "It's the disease, Mom. You can't take it personally." "Yes, I can. You don't know everything. You haven't been married for 49 years. "Mom, it's the Alzheimer's. His brain—" "It's not about his goddamn brain. He should have known it in here." My mom jabbed her fingers at her heart, and for the first time since my dad's diagnosis, I saw the anguish in her eyes. After 49 years, he should have felt it in here. My mom slipped inside the door and closed it behind her. Flurries continued to spit from the endlessly gray sky. I let the blinds close with a snap. She won't even talk about it, but she hasn't been to see him again. "She'll get over it," Stephen tried to reassure me. Katie came out of her room with her Hello Kitty backpack. "Mommy, I forgot to give you a note from school." She handed me a deceptively bright, sunny yellow paper, and Stephen and I read the bad news. Katie's school might close next year. So if we decided to stay, Katie might not be going to the school we had carefully selected. And if we moved, we could lose a bundle on our house with a vacant building down the street. "We'll deal with it." Stephen wrapped an arm around my shoulder. "I'm tired of dealing with things." "I know." I peered through the blinds again. "And this snow is getting to me. Name one good thing about snow in the middle of March." "Makes sledding a lot easier," Stephen said as he tossed a pair of snow pants to Katie. Her eyes lit up, and she began to pull them on before he could change his mind. "I'll take Katie to the park. Why don't you relax with a bubble bath or curl up with a book?" Perhaps it was the novelty of having free time that made it so difficult to decide what to do with it. I was still undecided when Katie hopped outside and Stephen paused at the door. "It can't go on like this forever," he said, and kissed the top of my head before following Katie into the cold. I started to close the door behind them, and then stopped, letting the cold air swirl around me, wondering if his words were meant as encouragement or as a warning, and then I knew what I wanted to do. Moments later, I ran after them, wrapping my scarf around me. "Wait for me!" I combed out Katie's hair after her bath, enjoying the ritual as always, the smell of the henna shampoo, the baby fineness of the curls at her temples, the smoothness as I gently teased away the tangles. I gave her a kiss on the forehead and sent her off to brush her teeth and await a story, just as my mom had done all those years ago. I picked up the phone, considered it for a moment, and then hit speed dial. "Hi, Mom. I was wondering if you would be in the mood to go shopping with me tomorrow, and if we have time, I could really use a manicure." I felt it the moment I awoke, something different. Perhaps it was being awakened by actual sunlight filtering in through the window shades, but it felt like something more. "Mommy! Daddy, come look!" Katie squealed, bouncing on the bed. She pulled open the blinds, flooding the room with light, blinding me, but I relished the brightness as I moved to the window and looked to where Katie pointed. Green shoots were just poking through the ground. "Tulips! Now it's officially spring!" I exclaimed, as excited as Katie. "Let's celebrate." Katie raced for the swings as my mom and I looked around the park, finding all the things we recognized and noting all the changes that had been made in the decades since our visits. "It's still cold as all get out," my mom complained, holding the collar of her coat tightly with one hand and a beach tote in the other. Just then, Stephen pulled up with my dad. My mom looked panicked for a moment, started to fuss with her hair, and then stopped, turned as if she were going to walk away, then turned back and squared her shoulders, ready for battle. My dad approached, eyes sparkling and wearing a big smile. My mom almost returned it when he winked at her and said, "Ellen, you look pretty as a picture." He gave her a kiss, and in one smooth motion took her bag in his left hand and linked his right arm with hers, escorting her to the picnic table. By the time Stephen and I joined them with Katie, my mom's eyes were sparkling too. "Do you remember taking me here when I was little, Dad?" I asked. "Of course." A newspaper peeked out of my mother's tote. My dad pulled it out and with great confidence began a meticulous process of turning and folding, running his hands along each fold to crease it neatly. When I realized what he was doing, a lump formed in my throat, and I met my mother's eyes briefly. We each tried to smile. My dad finished his work of art and grinned. "A hat for the little one," he said, putting it on top of Katie's head. She beamed. "Grandpa used to make sailor hats for me when I was your age," I said, my voice thick. "Too bad we didn't bring a kite," Stephen said, and I realized then that he was holding my hand. He squeezed it. "He used to take your mom here to fly kites when she was little." My mom grinned mischievously and pulled a new brightly colored kite out of her tote. I shielded my eyes from the sun to see my dad show Katie the art of kite flying. His words were lost in the wind, but Katie's response rang back clearly. "Okay, Grandpa, I'll remember." And with those words, I realized that it wasn't too late. My dad might have only fleeting moments when he knew Katie was his granddaughter, but Katie would always know him as her grandpa. She would know him and remember him because of the time she spent with him now. Katie's laughter carried on the wind, and suddenly the air seemed to be filled with it. So many families out of hibernation enjoying the first sunny day. And then I remembered what every Michiganian should remember. Winters in Michigan could be cold and bleak, but when spring came, and it always did, it was simply glorious. Next year, I would remember. About the author. Katherine VanZwoll lives in Michigan with her very creative daughter and their ornery cat. Katherine has been a writer for as long as she can remember. She entered writing contests as a child, wrote a novel at age 13, which she burned when she rediscovered it at age 19, and took creative writing classes in college. After college, Katherine took the road most traveled and got a real job, but has been inspired to start writing again by her daughter, who doesn't let a day go by without saying, "I have a great idea." Seeing her daughter seize each and every day, playing the piano, performing in plays, writing books, painting, and thinking up a gazillion inventions reduced the appeal of being a couch potato on her time off. So Katherine is now a business analyst by day and writer by night, with lots of chauffeuring to piano practice, play rehearsal, choir performances, etc. in between.
This short story was read to you by Vanessa Wallstra. This short story and other equally wonderful tales won the 2013 Write Michigan Short Story Contest, sponsored by Kent District Library, Grand Rapids Public Library System, and Schuler's Books and Music. It can be found in the Write Michigan 2013 anthology, published by Chapbook Press, Kent District Library, and the respective authors. All rights reserved. This audiobook recording was made possible using Studio KDL recording equipment, available for public use at select Kent District Library branches.